The chapel smelled of beeswax and lilies, the way a house smells when every window has been shut against a storm, and someone insists on lighting lamps anyway. Every face in the pews had been trained for the photograph of contentment, a practiced tension of jaw that only loosened at the corners of the eyes, a small damp smile as if some private sympathy had just been offered. They watched me the way one watches a ship that has found its mooring, admiring the ropework, the brightness of the sails, the exact way the figurehead holds its chin. I wore white the way one wears a uniform, intention, polish, the refusal to show seams. He stood at the altar like a measured piece of architecture, not so much alive as assembled to sit and be admired. His suit had been cut to make stillness flattering. His hands lay together in a calm that read like an oath. There was, in the way he inclined his head, an economy of gesture that suggested rehearsal rather than impulse. People called it grace. The press photographers would later call it restraint. My mother called it useful. I called it relief. We had arranged the ledger like everything else, accounts balanced, signatures made with the sort of neatness a person uses when they intend their handwriting to be liable in court. There had been a room with a long table where invoices and pedigrees lay side by side, where a solicitor with steady fingers folded paper and slid it toward my mother, as if presenting a menu of ethically ambiguous entrees. The figures did not always add up cleanly. There were liens on houses no one wanted to remember, a school debt that had been deferred until after 3 successive heads of household had made promises, a small, unseemly mortgage on our name that had become a kind of curse. I had been taught quietly that marriage was a way to balance a ledger. Assets spread like butter across bread, deficits hidden under the crust. He was one of those rare creditors whose ledgers were not only numbers but also options. He possessed, or so the solicitor said, 2 things I had not known to ask for: taste and privacy. He could place, the man with the briefcase intoned, a gentle architecture around our troubles. There were terms, not cruel, not cruelly exacting, merely exacting enough to keep us taut, and in exchange my family could continue in the style to which it had grown used, which is to say with dignity and enough money to forget the worst of the counting. I had learned to read the movement of a pen as if it were a tide chart. My life had been kept afloat by precisely placed signatures. I signed. If you are enjoying this story, tap like and stay for the full reveal. Public life rewards smoothness. At receptions and rehearsals, his stillness read as an achievement. He applauded with the right rhythm, but never too loudly. He laughed in the right places, and had the uncanny ability to look at a person as if remembering their name and their debt at once. Yet for all the applause, there were small things that did not behave the way the rest of the room expected. In a drawing room lit by beeswax candles, the flames leaned, everybody noticed that, toward him and then away, like a tide hesitating at a strange shore. Mirrors slowed their replies when he passed. I caught that first at the house warming for his sister. A hall of mirrors meant to double the fortune of the household. My reflection lagged, as if my image had to find myself a second late, and when I turned to check he was there with his head cocked, watching me as one watches a curious instrument. I told myself that I was tired. I told myself that candlelight makes everyone appear to fall out of time. When 2 people are made public enough, the small anomalies of gesture become part of the mise en scène. They are charming eccentricities in dinner-party gossip. I told myself these things in a voice that was as refined as the gloves on my fingers, and I believed them, half. But there are small observations that gather into a shape at the edges of your life. In the weeks before the wedding, I collected details like coins, his photographs that always arrived a fraction of a second late, as if the camera could not quite make up its mind whether to admit him. His voice on the telephone, which sounded recorded, and then, occasionally, unbearably, human. The way he left notes in precise, round handwriting that read more like invoices than intimacies. The world had taught me to negotiate these discrepancies by making them useful. If a chorus of comments would dismiss him as other, I would take his otherness and frame it as refinement. It is easier to slip eccentricity into company than to carry a confession. My mother, who had long ago learned to translate every admittance into equity, rehearsed speeches about the virtues of steadiness and taste. "People tire of drama," she said, smoothing the lace at my wrist. "They prefer constancy." I preferred to believe her. There were moments of tenderness, too, that broke through the calculation and left me unstaunched. The night we signed the final papers, he waited on the threshold of the solicitor's office in the rain, and held up his coat for me with such an exactness that I felt the old, unexpected sailing of affection. When he helped me into a carriage as we emerged under the eaves, he did not hand me the umbrella. He held it above us both, and for an instant the world beyond the glass was only streaks of wet light. Later, in bed in my mother's house, I would replay the scene, measuring it against ledgers and learning that a small unaccountable tenderness could still appear in the margins of a transaction. The wedding itself proceeded the way all proper ceremonies proceed. The exchange of vows as if spoken from a ledger page, the clasping of hands whose sole purpose had been to demonstrate that two accounts were now linked. There was public warmth enough to generate a photograph. There were friends and distant relatives newly reconciled by cake. Yet underneath the satin and paper, I carried a quiet, mounting pressure, as if my body were an instrument tuned to listen for an off note. My fingers had learned to measure the slack of a letter. They did not yet know how to measure the kind of loneliness that waits for a pulse. After the last blessing and the polite, obliging kiss, my husband and I were shepherded toward the suite. A suite my mother insisted should look untroubled by the small arithmetic that had brought us there. The bridal chamber was a room of careful comfort, linen folded into exact squares, a dressing table with a circle of perfume bottles like mute witnesses. There was a reflecting pool set against the far wall, a shallow basin with still water meant to collect small things and make them beautiful again. The chamber was lit by beeswax candles, their flames leaning, as they had done in the hall and in the drawing room, toward the center where we stood. I noticed, with that peculiar clarity that comes when the world quiets, that the water's surface did not meet his face with the immediacy it met mine. When I leaned over to look, my reflection rose and sighed as if in apology. His arrived later, as if the glass had hesitated and then conceded. We undressed with the slow ritual of two people untying the last formalities. There was no clumsy fumbling. His hands moved as one expects trained hands to move, articulating and efficient. I watched him, cataloging what I could as if trying to make a new ledger of this quieter, private currency. He lay very still in the bed, his face shaded by the candlelight. For a long time I sat at the edge, feeling the linen cool beneath my palms. I attempted the most ordinary of tests. I placed my hand where a heart ought to make itself known, beneath the left side of his ribcage. I had performed the gesture once or twice in hospital wards where my brother had spent sleepless nights. I knew how to find the small percussion of life. His chest did not rise in a way that declared a breath. There was a certainty to his stillness that was not the sleep of one who is only exhausted. When I moved my fingers to his wrist to seek a pulse, the skin was warm beneath my touch. His hand answered my fingers with the faintest of resistances, not a pumping beat, but a gentle, uncanny pressure. An evenness that could have been rhythm or machinery. I should have recoiled. I remember the way the word should sat like a pebble in my mouth, hard and tasteless. Instead, I laughed, a small, brittle sound, partly to steady myself and partly because there is a cruelty in laughter that comes before real fear. He opened his eyes, and for the first time since the day we met, I felt the sensation of being seen not as inventory, but as a possibility. He did not appear surprised by my question. Surprise would have been a human thing. He blinked with a slow thoroughness, then, very, very slowly, brought his fingers to my chin and turned my face to the candlelight. "Do you mean it literally?" he asked. His voice had the tidy quality of an accountant reading back a sum. "Do you mean not human?" I had rehearsed words for every public contingency, but not for this one. I had prepared a speech for the way to charm aghast relatives and scold any impertinent gossip. I had not prepared for the feeling of being the first person to ask him, in that room lit like a reliquary, a question that might undo everything. "Yes," I said. The word left me like a stone. It was small and unavoidable. He gave a thin, almost amused smile. Not the learned smile I had seen at dinners, but something that felt like a memory of humor. "And what would you say then that I am?" There were stories that would have made the moment into a melodrama. Automata with clockwork hearts, men forged from iron who longed for extinguishable breath. I refused to reach for them. The solicitor had been precise. He had never used terms that might scandalize. He had described assets and obligations, taste and privacy, a kindness that could be architectural in its generosity. He had not signed us up for myth. I kept my answers the way I had kept my life, in clean, practical lines. "You are not the sort of human who answers in the ways we expect," I said. "You are delayed. Your reflection lags. Your touch is precise. You are set to a measure." He laughed again, a small sound this time that might have been pity. "Set," he echoed. "I like that verb." He sat up as if deciding something in the small movement. The candles threw his face into planes and shadows. For a minute there was a stranger across from me, not the amenable spouse so much as a calculation that had grown a face. "Why did you marry me?" I asked. The question had been rehearsed for the ledger, but it bore a larger weight now. There is a world where people marry to settle accounts, and there is another where people marry to try to learn how to live. My family certainly had desired a solution, but I wanted more. Whether under the arithmetic there had been, for him, any desire akin to the one that had pressed me into the decision. He considered that. The way he considered made me think of an instrument being tuned. Small adjustments, tests, and then a soft, decisive movement. "Because it was offered," he said simply, "and because I thought, perhaps mistakenly, that I might learn something." And what would that be? The word learn sounded like a dangerous thing between us. Learning implied failure and the need for instruction. Marriage, in my family's view, was more often a demonstration than a course. He reached across the bed and touched the reflecting pool with the tips of his fingers. The surface broke in concentric, slow rings, and the candlelight climbed the ripples like a small, shy animal. "I thought," he said, watching the water, "that I might know what it is to feel the weight of time on a life. Gravity, fatigue, the rust of small mistakes. I have observed such things, but observation is not the same as participation." I felt the floor of my thought shift. He spoke as if he had been a visitor to the shore who wanted to step into the sea. To ask to be human is to ask to become vulnerable. It is a surrender of the exactness he so clearly prized. I thought of my mother smoothing the surface of our misfortunes, of the ledger entries that had bound us into tidy categories. To choose vulnerability would mean accepting expense and the possibility of ruin. "You could have said no," I said, "because there is a cruelty in phrasing consent as permission. You could have refused the bargain." He turned and looked at me then, his eyes slow and intent. "Someone had to say yes," he replied. "And you said yes, too." There was truth in that. To sign the papers was not only to accept relief for my family, it was to take a step into a life partitioned into other people's expectations. I had been taught to think of my decisions as investments. Now, in a room that smelled of wax and lilies, I felt them as experiments. We sat in a silence that was not empty so much as thick with the potential for sound. Outside, a window shook with the first gusts of a wind that had been waiting all day. The candle flames leaned again, as if trying to catch breath, and the reflection in the pool trailed his image a fraction of a second behind itself. I found the delay oddly moving, like someone arriving late to their own soliloquy. "Will you teach me?" I said at last, and the words surprised me with their softness. It was not only a question about instruction, it was an offer toward an exchange I had refused to consider in the ledger, that my labor could be tenderness rather than arithmetic. He looked at me with a focus that was close to hunger. "If you will," he said, "I will attempt it." Attempt. The word implied risk. It acknowledged the possibility of failure and, with it, the possibility of an ethic, that to try and fail is a kind of moral work. I imagined then the slow domestic scenes of apprenticeship the transcripts had hinted at. Underbaked bread and burnt tea, hands clumsy with an iron for the first time, apologies learned in the shape of lids not quite fitting their pots, the image of him learning to misplace a plate, to drop salt without thought and then laugh at himself. Such small acts of humiliation was heartbreakingly human. I could have walked away. I have lately learned the small power of decisive steps. Many of them are conservative, others are brave. I did not walk away. For one thing, the bargain had been struck not only for me but for the safety of the family name. To leave would be to restore certain shame. For another, the thought of loving, imperfectly, was stirring something in me that no ledger could tokenize. So I placed my hand on the underside of his wrist again, this time not to test, but to offer. His fingers tightened minutely around mine in acknowledgement, a gesture not required by contract but given freely. The tiniest of rebellions. We spoke for hours in the geometry of the bed. Measured phrases, awkward admissions, the polite economy of two strangers trying to be more. He told me, in clipped statements, of observing crowded markets and maritime docks, of having found in them a fascination with the failure of things, the way fish rot when left too long, the way old ropes fray. He spoke of having read ledger after ledger, and having decided that accounts, however clean, left a person unaccounted for. I told him of my brother's nights in hospital, of the stubborn way my mother had kept the account books closed, and of my own training in making small sacrifices tidy. It was not a confession so much as a cartography of each of our lives. At some point, perhaps because there were things that had to be done, perhaps because the night demanded a ritual, he stood and went to the reflecting pool. The candles leaned like courtiers. The water received him, and then, after that small interval, returned a man who was almost, but not quite, the man who had entered. He spoke to his face in the reflection, as if practicing the right inflection. I heard the faintest delay in his voice, an echo that returned to him after his own words, like a room that clapped a hearing a second too late. It struck me then that my recognition of his otherness had a cruelty of its own. To see him as inhuman would be to free myself from any obligation to teach or to care. To see him as capable of change was to risk being broken. I had been both pragmatic and sentimental enough to know which of those choices would cost me more. We lay down again and, for a while, let the soft ticking of the hall clock mark small victories over time. I fell asleep in the kind of untroubled exhaustion one earns after a day of performance. But I woke before dawn, as if trained by the sound of some small animal. The chamber was a cave of golden light. The candles had burned low to stubs, their wax pooled like small pale moons at the base. The reflecting pool had congealed to a skin of stillness, and he was standing by the window looking out at a city that had not learned yet to forgive our transaction. I crossed the room without making a sound. My footsteps, which in public had been precise and steady, felt foolish and clumsy now, as if I were not used to my own weight. I stood behind him and placed my hand at the nape of his neck, where the collar met skin. There was warmth under my palm, but not the ebb of blood beneath bone I have known in other hands. Instead, there was a slow, steady hum, like a lantern that had been left to glow in a remote chapel. It was not mechanical in the crude way of myth, but rather a different quality of continuity. He did not turn. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked. The city began to wake in the faintest way. A carriage clopping, a distant bell, the sound of a baker opening his window. He inhaled as if preparing to answer with something that might balance truth with courtesy. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "I think regret is a useful teacher." I pressed my forehead against the nape of his neck. He smelled faintly of beeswax and ink and something green and marine like the inside of a shell. It was not an unpleasant perfume. There was in the smell a sense of order and of the sea. I thought of the nautical maps my father had kept folded in the bookcase, his notes that navigated currents and scrubbed reefs. My own life had always been tied to such maps. How one keeps a family afloat, the way one anchors a social position. Here, in this odd intimacy, there was a different kind of chart to learn, one that measured affection in cups of soup, in learning to love the small failures of a spouse. "I will teach you," I said again, softer this time, meaning that I would teach him to be a kind of partner that does not vanish when the accounts are balanced. "We will begin with bread." He laughed, this time fully, and for the first time without reserve. "Bread," he echoed. "Then salt. The promise to teach and to be taught is not a flashy thing. It is work that takes a great number of days and a great many small apologies. It is the kind of thing that will not make a headline. It is rather the way the ordinary accumulates into intimacy. But the thought of it steadied me in a way I had not expected. We sat by the pool and made plans as if we were constructing a map, a morning class in which he would learn to turn a kettle without burning it, a promise to watch over a loaf as it might overcook, a pledge to accept the slow embarrassment of burnt fingers. He agreed. He asked the right questions, the kind that show a mind used to following procedure but now willing, tentatively, to depart from it. There was a dignity to the idea that he would attempt these failures. In the ledger of a life, to risk a folly for another person is a deposit into an account that pays interest in affection. But my conscience has a memory, like a ship remembering a storm. I knew that choice bears costs. If he attempted to become human, there would be consequences beyond awkward meals and mislaid spoons. There were old wives' stories and the new laws of bodies that age and break. There were infections and fevers and the slow decline of flesh. I thought of my brother in the hospital again, and the way illness had a politics as well as a biology. One family's charity is another's debt. If he chose to try, if he made his attempt toward vulnerability, what would that exact from him and from me? What would it demand in sleeplessness, in care, in the exchange of small humiliations for the big intimacy that binds people together? Before I could form a further question, he put his head against my shoulder and breathed, not with the reckless rise of a vivified chest but with a measured humility. I wanted to name that breath. Was it an effort, a practice? But in the early light it was only respiration and the small, human noise of two people awake in a room that had once been stage. I let myself believe that something like a beginning could be made of this. We did not sleep again. Instead, we sat and talked at the scale of small things until the sky began to edge with a suspicious gray. We spoke of how to fold sheets so that they wore evenly, of how to iron at the speed that reduces seams without searing fabric, of the indignity of forgetting to salt the water for pasta. I found myself explaining to him the way a bruise swells into a story you cannot tell, unless you consent to its pain. He listened as if taking notes. At one point he surprised me by reciting, because that is what he did sometimes, turning everything into a practiced thing. A line of a poem I knew from my grandmother's reading. It was out of time with the rest of his speech, a stray lyric. The intonation was not wholly correct. It arrived a fraction late, like his reflection. But the attempt was tender in itself. I laughed in the way you laugh at a child making an effort to pronounce a difficult word. It was the kind of laughter that bears the seeds of a new affection. Mid-morning, from the corridor beyond our suite, there came a soft knock. My mother's voice, filtered like a telegram, called out to ask if we were to be joined for luncheon. The normal world pressed its ear against our door, expecting the same calibrated answer. I could have kept all of this private, a secret between two people who had the habit of being discreet. But secrecy can calcify into shame. I opened the door. My mother's face was already arranged in the expression of someone who had resolved practicalities. "How are you feeling, dear?" she asked, taking in the scene with that remarkable ability. She has to read the state of a room at a glance. Her eyes paused on the reflecting pool, on the ring of wax in the basin, on the candle's blackened wicks, and then returned to me. I could see the ledger re-entering her mind, guests, bills, obligations. "I am well," I said, and the words were untrue and true at the same time. She smiled and offered a tally of luncheon guests, the names of neighbors to be thanked. The request that we appear at society the following week for the presentation of plates. She moved as if performing additions, balancing out the household rhythm with the ease of one who has been the keeper of accounts for many years. When she left, she kissed me the way a person with many policies and few illusions kisses another, a polite, sharp humidity. After the door closed and we were alone again, he turned to look at me as if studying a map. "What will your mother say?" he asked. "When she knows that I am not what she expects?" I felt the old, hot scrape of shame rise in me. The immediate shame of being the bearer of an anomaly that might reflect on her management. My mother had wrested stability from calamity before. She had dressed ruin in good sheets. She would be capable of making peace with any oddness that preserved the family credit. Still, seeing the worry line at the corner of his mouth, I understood the social reality we both inhabited. Otherness makes simple things sharp. "I will tell her," I said. "I will say that I married a man who wants to learn how to be vulnerable. She will grumble about imprudence, but she will accept the account so long as it appears tidy." He watched me with that slow attention, as if measuring whether I was offering him a rope or a lifeline. "Will you teach me then, in earnest?" he asked. "Not as a demonstration, but as practice?" "Yes," I answered. The verdict felt like a deed. We made a small plan there, in the half-light between the candles and the new day. Bread, salt, ironed shirts, an afternoon class and taking a small walk without trying to control every step. It was a list reduced to practicalities because intimacy is taught by repetition more than by epiphany. A loaf burned and then accepted is a greater proof of affection than 1,000 declarations. When I say that I had realized the truth, that my husband was not human, I do not mean that the moment unrolled like a curtain and an object was revealed. Revelation in life is not always a single bright stripe. It is sometimes the slow coruscation of many small facts coming into line. Nevertheless, on that night, when the chamber was dark and the reflecting pool had made its delayed images, I knew with a precise and almost mathematical certainty that he was other. The knowledge was not a hammer blow. It was rather a strange, delicate instrument that required learning how to hold. The decision to stay in that first morning was not romantic in any dramatic sense. It was not a sacrificial resignation, nor a heroic leap. It was instead a domestic calculus, an admission that the ledger could be rewritten, that debts could be balanced in new ways, that the practice of tenderness might be a better defense than the cold economy of reputation. I had spent my life performing prudence. Now I was, for reasons I only half understood, choosing a project that would cost more than it saved. We began, almost at once, with the smallest of tasks. He watched while I kneaded dough, noting the way my palms wore the wheat into submission. He tried carefully to imitate the pressure and failed in an endearing, glaring way. His hands were too precise, and so he underworked the dough until it flopped like a weak sail. We laughed at the result and then tried again. He listened when I explained the necessity of a pinch of salt and the patience of a long bake. I found, to my surprise, that teaching a person to make bread is a form of confession. You reveal how you keep your life warm by feeding it. You show them the labor that sustains ordinary joy. That first afternoon, as the bread rose in the warmth of an oven, we both watched like priests watching an altar. He asked me, quietly, as if returning to a math problem, "What will become of me if I try and fail?" "You will be human," I said, because at that moment humanity felt like the only possible outcome. The word slipped into the room like one pulled from some ledger of courage. There was no guarantee in it. Only the promise that failure is a teacher whose fees are paid in bruises and in the small redeeming acts of mending. He held the word as one holds a small coin. "I am willing," he said. "If you are." I was willing too. I had already admitted that much to myself, but willingness counts for little if it is not practiced. We had made an agreement between a woman trained to manage ledgers and a man trained to be exact. It would need daily trials rather than rhetorical commitments. We ate the first, imperfect loaf together, butter melting into grooves that were not wholly even. It tasted of flour and of the attempt. We both reached for the same piece at once and laughed, the sound small and a little embarrassed, and then divided it without ceremony. Outside, the city continued with its polite indifference. Inside, under the wax-swept light, we made our private accounting. Debits of mistakes, credits of small care. There are many ways a life can go on from such a beginning. Some lead to ruin, some to a long accumulation of warmth. I am not at liberty to tell the whole story now. There are conversations I must keep private because they are the work that seals a household, and there are consequences I cannot yet name. For now I will say only this, that when the candles leaned and the reflecting pool delayed his face, I chose to remain. And in choosing I began the long, quiet labor of teaching and of being taught. The door between the private chamber and the world beyond is thin. Someone will always knock. I know in the fact of it that what follows will demand more than bread. It will demand tenderness when I am tired, care when it is inconvenient, an elevation of ordinary apologies into the architecture of a life. But I have walked my share of rooms set with parlors and ledgers. I know how to arrange things so that beauty is possible. He is not, as the ledger would imply, a mere asset to be displayed. He is other, a thing of delayed reflections and precise hands that now look at me with an interest that borders on worship. Whether that worship is of the self or of the possibility of being human, I have not yet figured out. For now, I count the small victories: a loaf not burned, a shirt ironed without choke, a laugh that is not merely polite. We have many trials ahead. Late in the afternoon, a servant brought up a parcel, plates and napkins my mother deemed suitable, and asked if we required anything else. I declined, keeping my attention on the table where the imperfect bread had been sliced into 2 generous pieces. He took his portion and closed his eyes as if tasting memory. For all the mystery of his nature, there was something gospel-like in that gesture. Even they, whatever they may be, seek the comfort of shared bread. At dusk, when the candles had been stoked and the wax pooled into pale moons again, he surprised me by picking up a small chipped mug from the dressing table and setting it in the middle of our table as if making an altar where once only ledgers had been kept. "For the mornings you will not want to be kind," he said, and there was a small attempt at humor in the way he said it. I looked at him, the man who had entered the ceremony with the posture of a piece of architecture, and saw, for a moment, the possibility of a different structure, something that yields and holds in turn. The ledger will not be erased, there will be reckonings. Medical bills, social price, the probable small humiliations of bodies that learn and fail. But at the center of that accounting, in the room where beeswax burns and lilies fade, I had found a different sort of sum, one that counts the patience of daily care as currency. We would begin, then, with bread and with salt, with burnt fingers and apologies, with the slow arithmetic of loving someone who needs lessons in being loved. I would teach him to make tea without scalding his fingers, to learn the small arts of wait and apology. He would teach me, perhaps, how to see the world with a clarity unclouded by the need to keep accounts. Some part of him was already there, the quiet consideration, the attention to speech, the awkward attempts at humor. Whatever his origin, he had, in his willingness, offered a possibility that was both dangerous and irresistible. Night came and we folded our sheets, not as a ceremonial act but as a practice of care. When we smoothed the linen with our palms, we learned how 2 hands move in concord and discord, and where one hand lacks, the other can hold. Outside, the world remained the same. Obligations, guests, the slow, predictable tide of gossip. Inside, in a room lit by beeswax and lilies, with the reflecting pool still lagging its image at the edge of perception, we began the first days of an experiment neither of us had warranted in our ledgers. The experiment began with bread and a promise, but it would require more than bread. When the city clock bell struck 6, I placed my hand on his wrist again, and felt that even that small surface had changed, not into something wholly human, but into a thing that might in time approximate it through the repeated acts of learning and failing. I am not a saint, nor a martyr. I am a woman whose accounts are complicated by debt and by loyalty, and by a curiosity that has always lived in the margins of my life. I chose to stay because it was the bravest practical thing I could do, and because, in the last softness of the day, he looked at me as if I were the only map he had. We turned off the candles and let the reflecting pool sit like a mirror waiting for its cue. The wings of the room folded around us. I will not say that the rest is simple, yet in that quiet, when all the household machinery had stopped, when the ledger was closed for the night, I knew 2 things with a clarity that did not belong to accounting, that I had discovered, on our wedding night, that my husband was not what I had been trained to expect, and that I had decided nonetheless to teach him how to be vulnerable, to try with him the small daily failures that might make a life tender. Dawn would bring new questions. The world beyond our door would resume its sums. But for the first time in my life, a calculation seemed possible that had nothing to do with balance sheets. The arithmetic of companionship, where the dividends are warmth, and the interest is the slow accumulation of ordinary kindness. We turned off the candles and let the reflecting pool sit like a mirror waiting for its cue. The wings of the room folded around us. I will not say that the rest is simple, yet in that quiet, when all the household machinery had stopped, when the ledger was closed for the night, I knew 2 things with a clarity that did not belong to accounting, that I had discovered, on our wedding night, that my husband was not what I had been trained to expect, and that I had decided nonetheless to teach him how to be vulnerable, to try with him the small daily failures that might make a life tender. The apprenticeship took place in the shape of ordinary days. We divided time into lessons as if we were both students of some domestic conservatory. Mornings of bread and afternoons of soup. Evenings devoted to the art of waiting for a kettle to boil without watching it like a shore watcher scanning for sails. He kept notes in a slim book. It was terrible in its order, headings and subheadings and a precise column for errors, and would, at the end of each day, present a list of the ways in which he had failed. He wrote, in a handwriting that stayed at once elegant and severe: undermixed dough, oversalted stew, pressed iron too hot, and beneath those entries, as if incrementally allowing himself the possibility of sentiment, laughed when burned, or forgot to close window, left tea to cool. The first weeks were an education in small humiliations. He burned his fingers with a vigor that looked absurd on hands so used to being exact. The burn left a curious pale crescent that he handled with a tenderness that, at first, embarrassed me. It was as though the scar were an experiment. He watched its healing as one might watch a newly planted vine, cataloging the way tissue repaired itself. I learned, in turn, to swallow the instinct to tidy every misstep. I would have polished the edges of his errors, hidden them under the rug of propriety, but tenderness requires the opposite, the conspicuous airing of flaws until they become bearable. There were social consequences. At a luncheon not long after the wedding, my mother's friends took note of his manner, gentle, slightly delayed. One of them, a woman with jeweled gloves and a voice made to translate gossip into doctrine, pressed me with the sort of curiosity that smells of ledgers. "Does he ever surprise you?" she asked, as if surprise were a scandal or an annuity. I answered, because I am trained to supply the right sums, that he surprised me every day. The woman smiled in the way of someone who counts on the predictable, and the moment passed. My mother, who had once smoothed a mortgage into a respectable entree, watched more closely. She said almost nothing, which was her way of observing an account with reserve. There were also small, incandescent victories. He learned to make tea without scalding his fingers. The first cup he made had an unusual bitterness, a consequence of impatience, but he presented it to me with a solemnity that made the worst cup taste like sacrament. He practiced the casual apologies that lubricate ordinary life. "Forgive me for leaving your gloves in the hall," he would murmur, as if practicing the phrase's rhythm. Once, he knocked over a vase while closing a drawer and did not attempt to tuck the fragments into some invisible ledger of explanation. He crouched on the floor, gathered the pieces, and held the small shards up to the light as one might examine a map to see where a root had been broken. "I did not mean to," he said. It was not eloquent, but it was true, and truth in its plainness is often more restorative than a flourish. I taught him the art of apology not as a performance, but as a muscle. Say the words, add a gesture, repeat until they become less foreign. He practiced saying, "I'm sorry," until the phrase lost its metallic edge and acquired the warm dent that comes from use. In public, these small confessions transformed him. Where once his stillness had been read as an affectation, humility began to soften the edges of his reserve. People found themselves responding to the humility more than to the perfection, as if the nervous economy of society preferred an imperfect ledger to a flawless one it could not touch. There were moments, however, where his otherness reasserted itself in ways even I could not domesticate. On a damp afternoon when I was away at an engagement my mother insisted upon, a servant knocked and announced that my husband had taken to looking out the window for hours, cataloguing the movement of carriages. When I returned, I found him at the sill, his hands folded behind his back, watching the rain annotate the street. He turned when I entered and, with his usual careful speech, said, "I thought perhaps if I observed enough motion, I would learn the cadence of a life." "You could have come to the kitchen," I said, half reproach, half invitation. The words were intended to suggest that living occurs as much in failure as in observation. He looked at me with a softness that made my chest unfamiliar. "I thought being near movement would remind me that there is wear," he said, "that things wear and need attention. It is strange to be hurt by the very longing that invites tenderness." I wanted him in the ordinary fray, the scalded fingers, the burnt toast, the childish, useless scold of a spoon not stirred enough. Yet I also wanted him to retain his quiet. The negotiation of that paradox was the day-to-day. I would coax him into the fray and then protect him when the fray bruised. Not all the costs of attempting to be human were minor. The first winter after our marriage, he caught a fever following an excursion into a raw wind that crawled down the alleys like an accusation. It began as a tremor in the hands and a pallor that could have been blamed on candlelight. Then it became a heat under the skin, an impatience of flesh that no ledger could predict. He grew quiet, less measured. The servants, who had grown used to his order, looked worried in the way servants do when their household's schedule is interrupted. I tended to him as if attending to a small ship that had taken on water. I patched, bailed, and hovered at the tiller. There were nights when his breathing stuttered in a way that frightened me. The rhythm I had once mistaken for indifference now different, fragile, and suddenly unignorable. I held his hand and felt, beneath the even pressure I had learned to expect, a pulse that skittered. It was not the steady hum of a lantern, but the young, irregular beat of a life learning its own limits. Watching him in that small illness, I understood with a peculiar clarity what it is to risk for another. Not the grand sacrifice spoken of in verse, but the daily erosion of self in service to the brittle animal of someone you love. At dawn, after a night of sweating and whispered indexes of fever, he opened his eyes and said with a dry throat, "Does this make me more human?" The question could have been a test of my devotion. Instead, I found that it was mostly a child's wonder at malady. I smiled at him as if at a child who has just discovered a new fact. "It makes you more vulnerable," I said, and the word felt like confession. And vulnerability is not the same as being embraced. I will tend you because I promise to learn, and because I care. Later, in spring, a small accident, one of the episodes I had hoped to teach him to avoid, left his thumb nicked when he attempted to pare a potato too swiftly. The cut became infected in a way that was all flesh and no metaphor, and for a time the infection resisted treatments as stubbornly as a creditor resists a delayed payment. The nights of his fever and the days when the thumb throbbed taught me things I had previously only read in books. The steadiness of a sponge against a wound, the way a small hand can become the entire business of your day, how a life might narrow to the contours of another's necessity. I would not romanticize the ugliness of those hours. There is something uncomely about caring, the rinsing of pus-stained cloth, the stench of antiseptic, the repeated application of poultices that promise little but are given anyway. Yet there is also holiness in it, a small ledger of kindness that accrues silently. My hands learned the intimacy of handling indecency. His face learned to look back at me not as an adjudicator of taste, but as an anchor. Neighbors began to talk. Gossip is the tax paid for living in sight of others, and our household, which once paid in currencies of etiquette, now paid in the currency of narrative. Some of the talk was cruel in the way only well-fed society can allow itself to be. There were insinuations about why a man who had the means would choose to make himself subject to illness. My mother endured such commentary with the same serenity she reserved for all incredulities. She had, after all, negotiated worse for a better return. But an aunt, more brittle in her opinion than wise in her counsel, asked me whether I had miscalculated. "You married a mystery," she said. "Mysteries don't come with guarantees." "Neither do marriages," I replied. It was not a comfort to her, but it steadied me. I have come to think that people ask the question of whether we miscalculated not to seek an answer, but to find in our uncertainty their own pardon. Slow changes happen the way tides change the shore. Imperceptibly, then suddenly. One morning, while I was drying the plates, I noticed that his reflection in the polished kettle arrived without its usual lag. He stood at the window with a shawl thrown around his shoulders, measuring some small piece of scaffolding work in the street, and his mirror image returned to the metal with less of that half-second delay that had been his signature. I watched it like a person peering for first signs of spring. He caught my eye and gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "It was helpful," he said, not explaining. The sentence held all the modesty of someone who had tried and failed and tried again. There were other signs, an incipient tremor in the hands that sometimes faded with rest. A way his laughter arrived with less ceremony, a mark of sleep under his eyes that could not be fully smoothed with cosmetics or careful slumber. These signs did not read as miracles so much as the accrual of ordinary wear. They were, in their sum, more present and less precise, and I learned to measure affection by their irregularities. Our public life adjusted. My mother continued to maneuver the household ledger, reconciling debts and appeasing neighbors, but she no longer delivered speeches about constancy with the same iron conviction. Step by step she permitted the idea that a man could choose to be vulnerable, and that such a choice might alter the balance of a family in ways neither purely economic nor purely sentimental. She began, in private, to ask him practical questions about his care in a voice that, though cautious, softened with a kind of maternal curiosity. "Do you sleep enough?" she would ask. which was a code for, "Do you take my daughter on a path that will not ruin her?" He answered with his habitual precision, and the exchange, though formal, had the warmth of ritual. My mother, who had once classified marriages as investments, now found herself cataloging medicines. It was a quiet transformation. There were moments of cruelty I will not dress in sympathy. Strangers once coerced into familiarity by my husband's prior reserve now attempted to exploit his new weaknesses. A charity organizer, seeing him as an object of curiosity, placed him in front of needlework demonstrations where his delay once made him look like a study. The press, always eager for an anecdote, wrote of "the strange husband" in a tone that thinned our private life into a spectacle. We learned the political economy of tenderness. It can be extorted, it can be displayed, and it can be stripped of its dignity by a world that longed for stories it can print. We endured. We also celebrated small domestic triumphs. There was the day he learned, finally, to iron a shirt in a way that pleased him. He stood back and inspected the collar with the look of someone who has at last deciphered an old map. There was the afternoon when he misread a recipe and added sugar to a stew. We ate it anyway and found the flavor oddly forgiving. There was a night when he forgot to put out the spare key, and we were locked out in the garden, laughing in the rain as we traced the house for a cellar window. Those days accumulated like credit in a previously barren account. As seasons turned, changes came that made even my ledger-bearing mother whisper in a tone edged with awe. A small freckling appeared on his forearm, the kind that comes with sun and time. It was not the flourishing of youth, but of exposure. Evidence that his skin, once impermeable to such occurrences, now found minor blemishes, as if they were signatures. Once, when he leaned his forehead against the window pane, watching the keyboats, I traced a freckle with my fingertip, and found myself smiling at the intimacy of that almost meaningless mark. There was no single moment when he became fully, undeniably like any other man. Instead, there were accumulations, a misstep here, an ache there, that made him less an object to be admired than a person I could carry in my hands. The ambiguity remained. I could not, nor did I wish to, specify the nature of his origin. The ledger had been adjusted, not rewritten. A year after our wedding, on an evening when the wind smelled of salt and the candles in the room threw their light in the slow economy of habitual ritual, he stood and took my hand, as if rehearsing an old promise. "Do you ever fear," he asked, "that you married an experiment?" "I married a man who asked to be taught," I replied. It was a smaller phrase than a vow, and perhaps truer. He tightened his grip, not to assert, but to commune. "And if the lesson remains incomplete? If I cannot be wholly less? If there are parts that remain other?" "Then we will keep tending," I said. "Tending is the job. It requires patience, and the capacity to be surprised by the same small acts for a long time." He bent and kissed my knuckles in a gesture that had, in its measuredness, grown to be an affection rather than a performance. I felt the warmth of him then, not as an abstraction, but as flesh and breath, and the small insistence of presence. That presence, more than any metaphysical accounting, was the ledger I chose to maintain. Not every day was patient. There were nights when I resented the way his curiosity consumed the household's quiet, his questions about the body's workings, his diagnostic approach to coughs and wounds, the way he measured even tenderness, and sometimes placed it on a scale. I would find him hunched over the ledger of his own emotions, writing observations as if they were departmental reports. I would pull him away, and impatiently press my face to his shirt and demand that he feel without measuring. Those moments, short and sharp, were necessary. They taught him that some knowledge is not meant to be catalogued. Time, which had once been to me the enemy of social standing, became an ally in an odd way. Where I had used it to smooth reputations and pay debts, now it allowed small habits to form. We formed rituals of failure: burnt bread on Thursdays, shoes left by the stairs on Tuesdays, the blanket always askew by midnight. These rituals were our liturgies, and within them our ordinariness thrived. Not all our trials were minor. A carriage accident some months later, an overturned wheel in a narrow lane, left him shaken in that way that goes beyond marks. He returned with a bruise across his side that made him wince when he moved. The bruise was prosaic, but the way he bore it was instructive. He disliked being assisted at first, the reflexive retraction of someone raised in the exactness of self-sufficiency, and then he accepted the help with a clumsy, grateful nod. In the days after, as I bathed and tended the sore, I felt the peculiar luxury of ministrations given without counting, a generosity that did not score for later use, but existed wholly in the moment. There was an instance that tested both our resolve and the limits of public tolerance. At a garden fête where my mother had insisted we appear as a demonstration of restored equilibrium, a reporter reached out for a quotation that would make our private experiment into print. My husband, unpracticed in the diplomacy of this world, answered frankly, and his frankness, unadorned and oddly touching, made the assembled crowd murmur. He spoke without flourish, of wanting to understand what it meant to wear a life that might fray. The paragraph that followed in the next day's paper was less tender and more hungry. They described him as the curious husband, and dissected our marriage for column inches. My mother, who had weathered many storms of public opinion, looked momentarily defeated. "It will pass," she said, which was both reassurance and admonition. "It will," I agreed, because in the calculus of reputation, time pays interest. But in private, I resented the way our fragile progress had been commodified. Despite the sting, however, there were people who wrote letters of kindness, strangers who had tasted our burnt bread or seen our imperfect shirts in a photograph and understood that imperfection could be brave. Those letters were small deposits. Years taught more than any single tutor. He changed slowly, not into a precise copy of myself or of any ordinary man, but into someone whose oddities softened to afford room for kindness. There were new aches. Age crept in as it does for all who stay in the world, in the softening of joints, the occasional forgetfulness of a recipe, the way his steps sometimes missed the beat on stairs. These were not miracles so much as proofs. The ledger, which had once been the chief metaphor of our lives, acquired an extra column labeled care, where the currency was time and tenderness. We paid into it every day. In the quiet moments, a rain-soaked afternoon, the hush after a party, a dusk when the beeswax threw a long amber pool on the floor, I would place my hand over his heart. I could not claim certainty for the metaphysical nature of what beat beneath my palm, only knowledge born of long watching, that the rhythm there had the capacity to beguile and to soothe in equal measure, that it was animated by the obligations and embarrassments of ordinary life, that it was, in its irregularities, the proof I sought. The children of friends grew up and brought small disasters to our table as if it were a harbor. We learned to receive them. A broken teacup mended with glue and a bandaged thumb celebrated like a victory. Those moments, noisy, messy, unsanctioned by protocol, were the texture of domestic tenderness. I discovered that to be intimate is to be perpetually ready for the banalities of crisis. There were also nights when I would wake and lie in the dark, counting not the finances that had once kept me awake, but the small expenses of care. The hours at his bedside, the wages lost to illness, the cost of a poultice. These sums were more onerous perhaps than the ledger entries of old, but they accrued in a different currency. In the calculus that now governed us, the returns were measured less in silver and more in the weight of a hand that chose to stay. One evening, much later, when the light had turned honey-colored around the edges of things, I found him at the reflecting pool with his sleeves rolled. The water, as always, answered him a fraction behind his own pause, but the delay felt less like a defect, and more like a place where he and I learned patience. He looked up at me and said plainly, "I have misread many things." "What matters?" I asked, because by then I understood that admission itself was the currency of our household. "That I thought being precise was a virtue superior to being fallible," he said. "I thought that minimizing error would save me from care. It did not. It saved me perhaps from small embarrassments, but it also prevented me from knowing the weight of being held." I placed my hand on his cheek and thought about the days we had burned our bread and laughed, the nights of fever and bandage, the mornings when his reflection arrived like a delayed singer to his own song. "We learned the hardest lesson," I said, "that a life must sometimes be humiliated in order to be intimate." He smiled then, not as an ornament, but as a person who had practiced gratitude enough for it to reach his face. "Teach me something new," he said, as if asking for a second lesson. I told him, because I liked the sound of it, to to fold the sheets a certain way so that the corners wore evenly. He watched, then fumbled the first fold, and we laughed at the impropriety of his inexpert hands. The laughter settled over us like a blanket. The story I will tell finally is small, because small things are true. One morning, years after the night when beeswax burned and the reflecting pool lagged its image, I woke to find the house quiet and the sun thin behind the curtains. He was still asleep, his fingers curled by the edge of the pillow. I crossed the room without waking the household and sat by his side. The sheet was threaded with a faint line of wear where we often kissed goodnight. I placed my hand on his chest as I had so many times before, not to test but to be present. His skin was warm, the breath under it uneven and human. I do not claim to know what he was before we agreed to teach each other, whether he belonged wholly to a category that would make for romance or myth. I only know what happened in the house we kept, that a person not entirely like us sought with earnestness to endure small pains and petty embarrassments to learn the shape of human life, that he let himself be taught to burn bread and to forget the spare key, that he took ill and allowed himself to be tended, that he acquired small stains and laughter and the tendency to misplace his gloves. Those changes were neither instantaneous nor complete. They were, however, real enough for me to feel the fact of them like a pulse beneath the skin. There is a ledger that will always be there, the one that counts debts and reputations and social capital. But there is another ledger I keep now, written in a language that is not arithmetic. The list of cuppings of tea, of misread recipes, of nights tended and fingers mended, of sheets folded and apologies made. The sums in this book do not total to prosperity. They add up instead to the slow, patient wealth of a life made by small, repeated acts. Late that morning, I took his hand and felt it warm and irregular. I smiled at the way his thumb, once without mark, bore a pale crescent now, a remnant of an earlier mishap that I had tended. It was only a small thing, a domestic scar, but it meant everything. I leaned in and kissed the spot where the skin had become lighter, and felt the small, immediate gratitude of two people who had chosen to remain and to work. Outside the window the city lived on, balancing its own accounts, producing its own gossip. Inside, in a room that still smelled faintly of beeswax and the salt air from the river, we folded sheets and burned bread, and learned to apologize for the noises we made. The reflecting pool still informed us of delays. At times his image still arrived a beat behind. The world remained ambiguous and generous in equal measure. When I say I realized on our wedding night that my husband was not human, I mean that I discovered an otherness that could either have been a reason to withdraw or an invitation to labor. I chose labor. The labor has cost us time and inconvenience and nights of worry. It has also brought small mirth and the deepening of intimacy I had never expected to find. I will not pretend I can sum it in a single concluding ledger entry. All I can offer is the evidence of a life, a chipped mug with my lipstick at its rim, a shirt ironed inexpertly but with attention, a hand that tightens on mine without calculation. We have not arrived at a metaphysical answer. We have instead arrived at each other in the unglamorous way marriages must, through the patient, sometimes tedious work of tending. He is not what I was taught to expect, and I am not what I once thought I would be. Between us we have written a new account, not of assets and liabilities, but of the daily, costly practice of being present. In the end, if there is any revelation to report, it is this, that the capacity to choose vulnerability, that deliberate decision to risk being harmed for the sake of connection, is what, more than anything else, renders whatever beats beneath a chest fully, recognizably human. Subscribe for more strange, tender stories like this.